Welcome back to the newest episode of Thomas Tells, where we talk about the samurai. We have a lot to cover, so buckle up, I guess. Also, as a disclaimer before we get into this is not at all comprehensive. It's just a general idea of who the samurai were and how they played into the history of Japan. So, don't expect me to cover every single period in Japanese history. We do not have the time, so even if I did want to do that, so let's just get on with it. So, when talking about the samurai, the obvious question is, what is a samurai? Well, glad you asked. I have a whole section dedicated to this. So, the samurai were the warrior class of Japan for a very long time. Had a high social, they had a high position in the social structure and were the soldiers for the army. They were the fighters. They did all the fighting. They were governed by the principle of Bushido, or the way of the warrior, which is similar to chivalry. We'll talk about their comparison with knights in a minute. But it's a warrior code, basically, governing the stating the principles of a samurai and traits a samurai should have. They also samurai served more powerful samurai, basically. More powerful warlords called daimyo, who were the wealthy landowners and lord class, basically. They would pledge allegiance to these daimyos, and then they would be their master, basically, until one of them died, basically. And this samurai had to pledge military service to this daimyo, so go out and fight and all that stuff. It's about the samurai and how they fought, and their application in wars is their armor. The samurai were very wealthy, being that since they had a high social standard and would pledge allegiance to powerful lords. So they had access to some pretty nice armor, including a helmet with multiple different pieces and something called a Maydate on the top of it, representing their clan, whole down through the chest, down the waist, armored sleeves, greaves, just a ton of stuff. I'm going to put a diagram up so you can see what I'm talking about, but, yeah. And on the topic of samurai equipment, I think I need to dispel a common myth, which is that samurai fought with their katanas. They didn't. The katana was a ceremonial weapon that you would see a samurai walking around a town with. It wasn't used on the battlefield. We'll get into how the samurai actually fought in a bit, but they did not use katanas. I mentioned their similarities with knights earlier, how Bushido is similar to chivalry. And I'd like to build on that. Samurai pledge allegiance to lords, just like knights, who would become the vassals of a more powerful lord, and then pledge military service in exchange for a fief, which is a piece of land. But I'm pretty sure samurai did not get. They both had a particular fondness for fighting on horseback. I'm going to talk more about how the samurai fought in a bit, but there was a whole thing surrounding horseback archery, and cavalry, having a horse and fighting on horseback is most of what made a knight military-wise. But samurai fought with horseback archery. The knights fought with lances on horseback. The knights also had extensive armor, but this armor was plate armor in the later period and would basically cover the entire body, while whether or not the samurai would wear a mask that would cover most of the body is, sort of different. And I'm pretty sure the plate armor was generally more, I think it was stronger, I believe. And also, plate armor wasn't the whole thing. Knights had periods of using mainly chainmail, so just keep that in mind. Alright, with those comparisons and that information out of the way, let's talk about the early history of samurai. When Japan was starting out, and suddenly in the Bronze Age, when Japan was just for her starting out and suddenly not. When Japan was just starting out and suddenly in the Bronze Age, when Japan was starting out and suddenly not. When Japan was just starting out and suddenly a part of the Bronze Age, rice kingdoms spread across the country. What is a rice kingdom? So, it's that system of how civilization expanded early on, which was just, I own the food, so a bunch of people come around here to get the food, but I'm more powerful because I own all the food. That's basically what was happening here, only specifically with rice. The most important of these rice kingdoms was the one where the emperor lived. And this is a very Chinese sort of system with the emperor in charge. So these daimyo couldn't really get protection from the government anymore and needed to protect their land. So what they did is hire the samurai. So this is where the samurai got their start, as bodyguards and protectors of the land of daimyo. This influx of samurai caused the independent daimyo to be more powerful than the emperor, which caused the emperor to be overthrown and a system called the shogunate to be created. The shogunate, it was just whoever had the title of shogun, which is the guy with the most powerful military and control of Kyoto. This is where the shogunate was housed for most of its history. It was changed a long time later, but we'll get to that. This shogun is the independent warlords. The independent daimyo still existed and were around. The most powerful one was the shogun. It was the shogun, basically. I don't really get interesting again. Like I said, Japan has a lot of periods and a lot to cover, but we're not really interested in all that. And the samurai really get interesting in the next part. The Sengoku Jidai was Japan's Warring States period, where a lot of independent clans started fighting each other and rebelled against the Ashikaga shogunate, who had ruled in Kyoto for a very long time. There was a succession crisis, basically, and a whole bunch of stuff going on with the shogun that caused it. A whole weird situation. I'll probably talk about the Sengoku Jidai. It's this whole own topic, basically. Like I said, the samurai were the warriors, so they were fighting in all of this, and more loyal to the daimyo than the shogun, which is another difference between the samurai and the knights, where the samurai were more loyal to their daimyo than to the shogun, or emperor. whereas knights had the whole divine right of kings thing. Basically, if a king went to a knight and told him to backstab his lord, the knight would probably do it. But if a shogun went to a samurai and told him to backstab his daimyo, the samurai probably wouldn't. Is basically how I see it. Again, it's not total. Plenty of knights would not like the king very much, and plenty of samurai would actually not care enough to betray their daimyo, but you know. So like I said earlier, the samurai did not fight with katana. Well, what did they fight with? I mentioned earlier that they were good horseback archers, but they were just good archers in general. The bow was the preferred weapon of the samurai, actually. With things like the katana being added to their arsenal later in periods. It was already there with Sengoku Jidai, but you get the point. It wasn't the first thing. To protect themselves, they were added to the arsenal later so the samurai could protect themselves up close. But even then, they weren't used over other weapons like the Yari long spear, the naginata, or of course the bow, all of which were just generally more effective. This was kind of the main point of samurai combat, just talking about how samurai fought that I can think of, but it's also a good time to mention that, you know, the samurai started to kind of fall down a bit here. A very slow fall for now, but they started to slip. And this is because the introduction of Ashigaru. What is an Ashigaru? It's a peasant soldier employed by the samurai. And were first introduced like a century earlier, maybe. At this point, the Ashigaru were basically cannon fodder, but that all changed with a man named Oda Nobunaga. This guy probably needs... you'd probably need his own video to fully go over what he did, but he was one of the main three unifiers of Japan during Sengoku Jidai. And started to equip his... and he's important for this because he started to equip his Ashigaru with actual military gear and started treating them not as cannon fodder, but as actual effective soldiers. And this was pretty effective because he managed to beat a bigger clan and then invade the capital. A whole lot of garbage later that we don't have time for, and eventually Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Tokugawa shogunate is in charge, and Japan enters another transition to the Edo period, where the capital is moved to the east, and it is now Edo. Generally, this basically means that, you know, peasant soldiers were introduced more and more, so samurai started to gradually fall off importance, but not substantially at all. Well, that is, until I actually forgot to mention another one of the samurai's preferred weapons, which is the gun. Sounds weird. Trust me, I'm not lying. I actually talked about this in another video where I talked about the Portuguese selling matchlock rifles to Japan. That happened a lot. Like, a lot. I'm pretty sure there was some statistics somewhere where Japan had more guns in its borders during this time than Britain had in its empire. This statistic sounds ridiculous until you realize that Japan had a lot of independent clans, all looking to grab rifles, which with pretty equal numbers of purchases between them, probably. I mean, there are some outliers, obviously, but there was a lot of recreation going on, where Japan would replicate the rifles that they got from the Portuguese to make their own gunpowder weapons, so there's those floating around, and this was during the era of pike and shot tactics, which means that Britain had armies with gunmen, of course, but probably a third or more of those armies were pikemen and not gunmen, meaning that in Britain's not the biggest empire at the time, I don't think it was at its full size yet, a lot of their armies were wielding pikes for a large portion of them. So it does make a bit more sense. So with that tangent aside, the samurai really liked guns. They were really effective, and they changed how the Sengoku Jidai was fought. And they kept getting more modern weapons from the Dutch, like, every opportunity that they got, even during the peaceful Edo period. This becomes important when we talk about the Boshin War, which is Japan's real wake-up call to modernization. So what happened was the Tokugawa shogunate that I mentioned earlier set up a closed country North Korea style system where no one can get in and no one can get out unless it's the Dutch who want to trade, but they have to do it at one specific port. This was kind of annoying for America, Russia, and Britain, who had economic and trade interests with Japan. So eventually, America brought gunboats to Japan and forced them to open the country. This made the clans of Choshu and Satsuma very mad, and they started to support the emperor and become more open to Western ideas, because at this point they think the shogunate kind of sucks. By this period, you had samurai fighting just katana in one hand, revolver in the other, basically. Or at least depicted like that. And early on, basically, that was it. But gradually, through this war and the post-war, the samurai just started being phased out in favor of a modern army, as gun is more effective. It's that simple. Guns are more effective. This led to just a decline of the samurai, and they just generally stopped existing at this point, because a modern army was generally more effective, and the whole country was really westernized after the Meiji Restoration. This is where the romanticization begins. It took me way too long to pronounce romanticization, and I'm not sure I even got it right. Anyway, this is where the romanticization of the samurai began. People started to basically reminisce about, the old days, where times were simpler and samurai killed each other with spears instead of soldiers killing each other with guns. So they started writing about the samurai, romanticizing them, and generally creating a lot of the ideas of the modern samurai, like the katana being used over the actual weapons that they used. And samurai were entered into both the historical and cultural textbooks, basically, after this, and, immortalized through culture, also people continuing to relearn history. So, hope you enjoyed that video. I mildly enjoyed making it. I'm joking. I did enjoy making this, but it is annoying. I have been recording for 26 minutes about that. Anyway, may or may not try to stick to a schedule. Depends on what's going on Saturday and Sunday, but I may or may not try to do this weekly. No promises, but, you know, who knows. Once again, hope you enjoyed that video. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this historical presentation. Thank you for watching. Leave any topic suggestions you may have in the comment section below. I enjoy all comment section discourse. And always remember that no matter how hard you try to run, no matter how hard you try to hide, economic interests of empires will find you and will cause you a civil war. Goodbye, everyone. And this is where the romanticization